The wind screaming through the Bitterroot Mountains didn't just carry ice. It carried the sharp, metallic scent of death. Silas Caldwell had survived a decade in this high-altitude purgatory, but he'd never stumbled upon a half-frozen bride in a snowdrift, a desperate woman clutching a satchel hiding a fatal secret. The sky above Lolo Pass had turned the color of bruised iron by early afternoon. Silas Caldwell knew that shade of gray intimately. It was the color of a mountain holding its breath before it tried to kill you. November, in the Montana Territory of 1,881, was unforgiving, and the barometer in Silas's knees told him a whiteout was less than an hour away. Silas was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. At 38, his face was a topography of windburn, thick beard, and scars earned from both grizzly bears and Confederate bayonets. He lived alone at the edge of Dead Man's Creek, trading pelts for coffee, flour, and ammunition twice a year in the valley, and speaking to no one in between. Solitude was his religion. The high timberline was his church. He was hoisting a freshly skinned timber wolf over his broad shoulder when he heard it. It wasn't the crack of a freezing pine bough, nor the shriek of a hawk. It was a dull, rhythmic thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood, carried faintly on the rising gale. Silas hesitated. The unwritten law of the Bitterroots was simple. You mind your own survival, and you let the mountain claim what it will. But something in the unnatural sound gnawed at the frayed edges of his conscience. Adjusting his Sharps rifle by his side, he turned his snowshoes away from the safety of his cabin and marched toward the treacherous switchbacks of the southern ridge. By the time he reached the old wagon trail, the snow was falling in dense, blinding sheets, erasing the horizon. Peering through the white fury, Silas spotted the wreckage. A lightweight buckboard wagon lay overturned in a ditch. Its rear axle snapped clean in two. The traces had been hastily cut. Boot prints and the frantic churn of horse hooves led away from the wreckage, heading down toward the valley. The driver had panicked, cut the sole surviving horse loose, and ridden off to save his own skin. "Damned fool," Silas muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He approached the wreckage to salvage whatever the coward had left behind. Food, blankets, maybe kerosene. Instead, beneath a stiff, ice-caked buffalo robe wedged against the splintered buckboard seat, Silas found a woman. She was curled into a tight, desperate ball. She wore a thin, lavender traveling dress made of cheap wool, completely unsuited for the high country, and a velvet bonnet crushed against her pale cheek. Her lips were tinged a terrifying shade of blue, and her eyelashes were heavy with frost. In her arms, gripped with a rigor mortis-like intensity, she held a heavy leather carpetbag. Silas dropped to his knees, ripping off his thick bearskin mitten to press two calloused fingers against the hollow of her throat. The pulse was there. It was as fragile as a moth's wing, fluttering weakly against the encroaching ice. But she was alive. "God Almighty, lady," Silas breathed. He tried to pull the carpetbag from her grip to lighten the load, but even in her comatose state, her fingers were locked around the brass handles like iron talons. There was no time to debate. The storm was now a deafening roar, dropping the temperature by the minute. Silas shrugged off his heavy outer canvas coat and wrapped it fiercely around her small, trembling frame. He hauled her into his arms. She was shockingly light, feeling more like a bundle of hollow bones than a grown woman. The 2-mile trek back to his cabin was an agonizing descent into hell. The snow deepened to his thighs. The wind battered them relentlessly, trying to rip the woman from his grasp. Silas's lungs burned as if he were inhaling shattered glass, and his vision tunneled. Every step required a monumental effort of will. He focused on the rhythm of his own heartbeat, forcing his boots forward through the drifts. He didn't know this woman's name, nor why she had been abandoned in the deadliest stretch of the territory. But he swore to the howling wind that the mountain would not take her today. When the dark, sturdy outline of his log cabin finally materialized through the blizzard, Silas nearly collapsed against the heavy timber door. He kicked it open, stumbling into the dark, freezing interior. He laid her gently on the braided rug before the massive stone hearth, his hands shaking as he struck a match. He ignited the fat wood and pine kindling he had prepared that morning, watching as the flames leaped up, casting a frantic, dancing light over her deathly pale face. The battle against the cold had just begun. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard battered the cabin like a battering ram, trapping them in a world of timber and firelight. Silas worked tirelessly. He stripped away her wet, freezing clothes, ignoring his own rigid sense of propriety out of sheer necessity, and dressed her in his oversized flannel union suit. He wrapped her in 3 layers of cured elk hides, and forced hot willow bark tea and venison broth past her cracked lips drop by drop. The thawing process was brutal. As blood finally began to circulate back into her frostbitten extremities, she writhed in feverish agony, crying out in a delirium. In her fever dreams, she spoke of a train ride from Philadelphia, of a man named Arthur whose fists were heavy, and she constantly reached out for the leather carpetbag Silas had placed on the heavy oak table nearby. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the mountain. Silas was sitting by the fire, mending a snowshoe with strips of rawhide, when a sharp gasp broke the quiet. He looked up. The woman was awake. She had pushed herself up onto her elbows, her wide, terrified amber eyes darting around the rustic cabin, taking in the cured traps, the hanging dried meat, and finally, the hulking, bearded man sitting near the hearth. Where am I? Her voice was a raspy whisper, raw from the cold and the fever. Safe, Silas said gruffly, not moving closer so as not to spook her. You're in the Bitterroots. Dead Man's Creek. Found you half dead under a buckboard 3 days ago. Your driver cut the horse loose and left you to freeze. The memory seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She slumped back against the pillows, closing her eyes as a single tear escaped, cutting a clean trail down her soot-smudged cheek. Mr. Reed, she whispered bitterly. He said the horse couldn't pull us both through the drift. Mr. Reed is a coward who likely froze to death in the valley before he hit the tree line, Silas stated plainly. I'm Silas Caldwell. Who might you be? And what business does a city woman have crossing Lolo Pass in November? She hesitated, her eyes instinctively darting to the oak table where her carpetbag sat. Silas didn't miss the look. My name is Alice, she said, her chin lifting with a fragile but distinct defiance. Alice Pendleton. I was on my way to Silver Bow. I am a mail-order bride. Silas stopped threading the rawhide. He stared at her, taking in her delicate features, the bruised exhaustion under her eyes. Silver Bow is an 80-mile ride through hostile territory, Miss Pendleton. Who is the man expecting you? Alice pulled the heavy elk furs tighter around her shoulders. His name is Josiah Gentry. We've been riding for 6 months. He owns a mercantile there. He sent for my stage fare. Silas felt a cold knot twist in his gut, a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. He set his work down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Josiah Gentry? Yes. Do you know him? Alice's voice pitched up with a desperate, fearful hope. Silas looked at the fire, watching a pine log crack and pop in the heat. I know him, Silas said slowly. And he doesn't own a mercantile, Miss Pendleton. Josiah Gentry runs the lowest, dirtiest saloon in Silver Bow. He doesn't deal in dry goods. He deals in whiskey, rigged faro games, and women. Alice's face lost whatever faint color the fire had given it. No, that can't be true. His letters. He wrote about building a home, about starting a family. I had nowhere else to go. Hope was all I had left. Gentry writes those letters to a dozen desperate women back east every year, Silas said, his voice softening, attempting a gentleness he hadn't used in years. He pays the fare, brings them out here, and claims they owe him an insurmountable debt for the travel. He forces them to work off that debt in the back rooms of his saloon. You didn't almost die to become a bride, Alice. You almost died to become property. The silence in the cabin grew thick, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Alice didn't cry. Instead, a hardened, bitter resignation settled over her features. She looked at the ceiling, her chest heaving, as she took a slow, ragged breath. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. "Bring me my bag, Mr. Caldwell," she commanded softly. Silas frowned but stood up. He walked to the oak table, picked up the heavy leather carpet bag, and brought it to the bed. Alice struggled to sit up. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with the brass latches. "I appreciate you saving my life, Silas," she said, her voice steadying. "And I appreciate your honesty about Mr. Gentry. But you are wrong about one thing." The latch sprang open with a sharp click. Alice reached her pale hand inside. When she pulled it out, she wasn't holding a Bible, or a dowry dress, or a framed tintype of a family back east. She pulled out a heavy blued steel Colt .45 Peacemaker. Silas tensed, his instincts flaring, but she didn't point it at him. She laid the heavy revolver on the quilt over her lap. Then, she reached back into the bag and pulled out thick, tightly bound stacks of United States greenbacks. Hundreds of them. Thousands of dollars in stolen banknotes. "I didn't come out here relying solely on the hope of a good man," Alice said, looking up at Silas with eyes that were suddenly older, darker, and incredibly dangerous. "I stole $8,000 from my uncle's railroad safe in Philadelphia to ensure my survival. Gentry wasn't my salvation, Silas. He was just my alibi. And the men my uncle sent to track this money, they won't let a blizzard stop them." Silas stared at the money, then at the gun, and finally at the woman in his bed. The storm outside had broken, but as he looked at Alice Pendleton, Silas Caldwell realized the real tempest had just been invited inside his home. Silas stared at the heavy Colt Peacemaker resting on Alice's quilt, then shifted his gaze to the stacks of greenbacks. $8,000 in 1881 was more than a fortune. It was a king's ransom. It was the kind of money that caused whole towns to burn, the kind that made honest men turn savage. "You didn't just invite a storm into my home, Miss Pendleton," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling like distant thunder. "You brought the devil himself. Who exactly is tracking that money?" Alice's amber eyes didn't flinch. The fever had burned away the frightened city girl, leaving behind a woman forged in desperation. "My uncle, Harrison Cole. He sits on the board of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. He's a cruel man, Silas. He used his wealth to keep my mother in poverty until she died, and he took me in only to use me as a bargaining chip to marry off to his business rivals. When I refused, he locked me in a cellar for a week." She touched the bruised skin around her wrists, the faint purple marks now visible in the firelight. "I knew where he kept his private safe in the study. I knew the combination. Taking the money wasn't just about escape. It was about crippling his pride. But Uncle Harrison wouldn't send the law after me. He wouldn't risk the public scandal. He hired Pinkertons, or worse, men who work in the shadows." Silas ran a calloused hand down his bearded jaw, calculating the odds. "If they tracked you to the stagecoach line, they tracked you to Lolo Pass. The blizzard bought us time, buried your tracks. But it won't stop men paid to hunt. They'll wait out the weather in the valley and come up the ridge when the ice crusts over." "I won't ask you to die for me, Silas," Alice said, her grip tightening on the handle of the Colt. "You saved my life. Show me the trail to the next territory, and I will leave before they find your cabin." Silas scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. He walked to the window, scraping a fingernail against the frosted glass to peer out into the blinding white expanse. "You wouldn't make it 2 miles in that snow, Alice. And I don't send wounded animals back into the jaws of wolves. You'll stay here. You'll heal. And when Harrison Cole's dogs come sniffing around my mountain, they're going to learn a hard lesson about trespassing." Over the next 10 days, the cabin transformed from a solitary refuge into a fortress preparing for siege. As Alice regained her strength, a quiet, cautious rhythm developed between them. Silas taught her the brutally practical ways of the high timberline. He showed her how to pack snow to insulate the cabin's foundation, how to strip, clean, and load the Sharp's rifle with frozen fingers, and how to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled approaching weather or approaching men. In return, Alice brought a strange, warm humanity back to Silas's isolated existence. She mended his torn canvas coats with precise, deliberate stitches. She baked hardtack biscuits that didn't taste like ash, and in the quiet evenings, she read aloud from an almanac she'd found on his shelf. Silas found himself lingering by the hearth, captivated not just by the soft cadence of her voice, but by the fierce, unbroken spirit that shone in her eyes. The mountain man, who had spent 10 years avoiding the touch of the world, suddenly realized he was terrified of the day she would leave. The uneasy peace shattered on the 12th morning. Silas was checking a snare line near the frozen edge of Dead Man's Creek when he saw it. The snow had crusted into a hard, walkable sheet of ice over the past 2 days. Half a mile down the ridge, near a stand of skeletal birch trees, black shapes were moving against the blinding white snow. He pulled his brass spyglass from his coat. Through the lens, the shapes sharpened into 4 men on horseback, bundled in heavy furs, their mounts struggling through the deep drifts. Leading them was a man wearing a distinct bowler hat, completely out of place in the wilderness, carrying a repeating Winchester rifle, resting casually across his saddle pommel. Behind him, Silas recognized a face that made his blood run cold. Josiah Gentry, the saloon owner from Silver Bow, was riding with them. Silas collapsed the spyglass and sprinted back up the ridge, his snowshoes kicking up sprays of ice. When he threw open the cabin door, Alice was at the stove. She took one look at his face and instantly reached for her Colt. "They're here," Silas breathed, grabbing boxes of heavy, .50 caliber cartridges from a shelf. 4 men. And your supposed groom, Josiah Gentry, is acting as their local guide. They must have crossed paths in the valley. Alice's face paled, but her hands were steady as she checked the cylinder of her revolver. Uncle Harrison's lead tracker is a man named Jasper Locke. He's infamous in Pennsylvania. He doesn't take prisoners, Silas. "Neither do I," Silas growled. "Lock the door. Bar the windows. Don't shoot until they are within 30 yards. I'm going into the timber." "Silas, no!" Alice grabbed his arm, her amber eyes wide with a sudden, desperate fear. "There are 4 of them. You can't face them in the open." Silas looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up to her face. Without thinking, he reached out, his rough, scarred thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "This is my mountain, Alice," he said softly. "They are fighting the terrain as much as they are fighting me. Keep the fire low. I'll be back." Silas slipped out the back window, disappearing into the dense, snow-laden pines, just as the first shout echoed up the canyon. He scrambled up a rocky outcropping that overlooked the clearing in front of his cabin. He lay flat on his stomach, the cold seeping through his canvas coat, and rested the heavy barrel of his Sharps rifle on a snow-covered boulder. Down below, the 4 men rode into the clearing. Jasper Locke halted his exhausted horse, his eyes scanning the smoke curling lazily from the cabin's chimney. "Ho, the cabin!" Locke yelled, his voice carrying a harsh, metallic twang. "We are looking for a runaway woman by the name of Alice Pendleton. We know she's in there. Send her out with the bag, and you have my word as a gentleman, you won't be harmed." Silence answered him. Inside, Alice was crouched beneath the front window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Josiah Gentry, a portly man with a greasy mustache and a nervous twitch, spurred his horse a few steps forward. "Listen here, whoever you are," Gentry shouted. "That woman owes me a debt. She's contracted to me. You send her out, or we'll burn you out." Up on the ridge, Silas adjusted his sights. He knew Locke's promise was worthless. The moment Alice stepped out, they would kill them both and take the money. Silas exhaled a long, slow breath, steadying his crosshairs on the chest of the man holding a torch near the rear. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps rifle roared, the thunderous boom shattering the quiet of the mountain. The man with the torch was thrown backward off his horse, dead before he hit the snow. Chaos erupted. Locke's horse reared, screaming in panic. "Ambush! Into the trees!" Locke roared, racking his Winchester and firing blindly toward the ridge. Silas rolled away just as a volley of bullets splintered the rock where he had been lying. He quickly reloaded, moving like a ghost through the timber, He flanked their position, using the roaring wind to mask the sound of his footsteps. Down in the clearing, Locke and his remaining hired gun took cover behind a massive felled pine. Josiah Gentry, paralyzed by fear, was still struggling to dismount his panicked horse. "Gentry, you fool, get down!" Locke barked. Before Gentry could move, a gunshot cracked from the cabin window. Alice. She had rested the heavy barrel of the Colt on the sill and fired. The bullet missed Gentry but struck his horse's saddle horn. The horse bucked violently, throwing Gentry hard into the frozen earth. "She's armed!" Locke yelled, his composure cracking. He turned his Winchester on the cabin and unleashed a barrage of fire. Wood splintered and glass shattered as bullets tore through the front of Silas's home. Silas saw red. He abandoned the high ground, sliding down the icy embankment with a terrifying speed. He came up behind the remaining hired gun, swinging the heavy wooden stock of his Sharps rifle. It connected with a sickening crunch, dropping the man instantly. Hearing the commotion, Locke spun around. He found himself face to face with a mountain man who looked more like an enraged grizzly than a human being. Locke fired from the hip. The bullet grazed Silas's ribs, tearing through canvas and flesh, but the searing pain only fueled Silas's momentum. He tackled Locke into the deep snow. It was a brutal, ugly fight. Locke was a trained killer, but Silas had survived a decade of hand-to-hand combat with the elements. Locke pulled a hunting knife from his belt, slashing wildly. Silas caught the man's wrist, twisting it until bones snapped. Locke screamed, dropping the blade. With a final guttural roar, Silas drove his fist into Locke's jaw. The tracker's head snapped back against a submerged rock, and he went entirely limp. Silas pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He clutched his bleeding side, his vision swimming. "Silas!" He turned. Alice had burst through the cabin door, the Colt still gripped tightly in her hands. She ran through the knee-deep snow, her eyes wide with terror and relief. Suddenly, a groan came from near the felled pine. Josiah Gentry, bruised and covered in snow, had pulled a derringer from his boot. He was aiming it squarely at Alice's back. "You owe me, you little thief," Gentry spat, blood bubbling on his lips. Silas was too far away. He reached for his sidearm, but his hands were slick with his own blood. "Alice, drop!" he bellowed. Alice didn't hesitate. She threw herself sideways into the snowbank just as Gentry pulled the trigger. The tiny bullet whipped past her ear. Before Gentry could cock the second barrel, Alice rolled onto her back, aimed the heavy Colt with both hands, and fired. The .45 caliber bullet struck Gentry in the chest, stopping him dead. The saloon owner slumped backward, his lifeless eyes staring up at the gray winter sky. A profound, ringing silence fell over Dead Man's Creek, broken only by the howling wind racing through the pine needles. Silas stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside Alice. She scrambled up, her hands frantically pressing against the bleeding wound on his side. "You're shot," she sobbed, tears finally breaking through her stoic facade. "Silas, you're bleeding." "It's a graze," he grunted, wincing as she applied pressure. He looked around at the bodies littering his front yard, then looked down at the fierce, beautiful woman who had just saved her own life. "Well, Miss Pendleton, it appears your groom won't be making the wedding." A breathless, watery laugh escaped Alice's lips. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her shoulders shaking. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't holding on to a rifle for survival. He was holding on to someone. "We can't stay here," Alice whispered against his coat. "Uncle Harrison will send more men when these don't return." Silas nodded slowly. He looked at his cabin, the only home he had known for a decade, now riddled with bullet holes. "I know," he said. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. "There's a trail west, through the Bitterroots, down into the Oregon valleys. Nobody tracks anyone through the Columbia Basin in winter. We take their horses, we take your uncle's money, and we disappear." Alice looked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the harsh, bright light of the snow. "We?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Silas reached down, intertwining his large scarred fingers with hers. "We," he affirmed. "You bought your freedom, Alice. Now it's time to figure out what you want to do with it." Alice squeezed his hand, a genuine radiant smile finally breaking across her face. "I want to ride west, Mr. Caldwell. With you?" They never made it to Silver Bow, and the wanted posters for Alice Pendleton eventually faded beneath the harsh western sun. Silas and Alice rode further into the untamed frontier, a mountain man and a runaway bride bound by gunpowder and snow. They built a new life in the Oregon high country, proving that sometimes the most enduring love is found when you have absolutely nothing left to lose.